In the outskirts of Boston. During the first turbulent years of World War I, as the entire American nation trembled under the weight of its own historical contradictions and men died for ideals they could barely fully comprehend, a small pigeon with ash-gray plumage and delicate white spots at the wing tips was born in the dovecote of Colonel James Smith. The dovecote itself was a structure of wood and clay, which rose on a rocky hill that dominated the surrounding landscape and allowed its feathered inhabitants a clear view of the sky in all directions. From the exact moment when her black eyes first opened to the world and reflected the clear light of a warlike dawn that promised times of radical change, this bird was selected through exhaustive criteria and specially trained to become a war messenger. Receiving the name Liberty, in honor of the colossal movement that was shaking the nation with its waves of hot blood and passionate hope that seemed to spring from the very bowels of American soil itself. Her breeder, Colonel James Smith himself, was a war veteran, hardened in countless border skirmishes, who had lost several deeply beloved comrades, brothers in arms whose deaths could have been prevented if communication between military positions scattered across the territory had not been so catastrophically deficient. These friends and subordinates fell victim not only to enemy fire, but to the informational chaos that reigned during those first months of the war, when communication systems were primitive and frequently ineffective. The colonel saw in the small newborn pigeon the infinite, almost limitless potential to save future lives through the transmission of encrypted and critical messages between the various military units scattered across the entire American territory like chess pieces on a cosmic war board. During nights when he could not sleep because of the ghosts of his fallen comrades, Smith spent long hours in the dovecote, holding little Liberty in his hands hardened by sun and gunpowder, whispering promises that this small creature would make the difference he had not been able to make. Since her most tender flight childhood, Liberty was raised with military discipline that could easily compete with that of the soldiers themselves who marched in the revolutionary columns. She was methodically taught to recognize various geographical positions through innovative training systems that Colonel Smith had adapted from European techniques, but modified for specifically American terrain. The pigeon learned to orient herself with almost supernatural precision through the rugged mountains of New England, even on cloudy days when the sky appeared like an impenetrable gray sheet, when visibility was reduced to barely 100 meters and the horizon became an impossible abstraction. Into her small avian brain was imprinted the ability to preserve her return instinct to the original dovecote with the precision of a biological compass that never failed, a gift of nature that Smith understood as a blessing from forces greater than simple biology. The soldiers who surrounded the dovecote fed her carefully with special grain grown on nearby farms using methods that the colonel had personally selected, constantly spoke to her with gentle but firm voices, and ensured that she developed a deep and almost tangible emotional connection with her caretakers that would accompany her until the end of her days. They spent endless hours feeding her from their own hands, patiently and consciously gaining her trust and gradually becoming an integral part of her small avian world. Her small body, though fragile in appearance like that of any other ordinary pigeon, harbored a heart that beat with extraordinary courage that her observers could almost feel pulsing beneath the gray feathers. Her heart beat with the same revolutionary determination that possessed the men who fought desperately in the muddy and blood-soaked trenches, where death lurked in every shadow and every unexpected sound could be the last that a person would hear in this life. Colonel Smith frequently commented to his general staff that Liberty had the soul of a soldier, that in her round, black eyes could be perceived a primitive but undeniable understanding of the importance of her role in the warlike struggle. During the first rigorous months of her flying life, Liberty was subjected to methodical and exhausting training that led her to fly increasingly greater distances and constantly test the limits of her endurance and navigation ability. She began with short distances of only a few kilometers around the dovecote, always wider circles that allowed her to become familiar with the terrestrial reference points that would help her in future missions. Then, as her chest muscles became stronger and her confidence grew exponentially, she was released several kilometers from the dovecote to find the return path on her own, relying only on her instincts and the flight wisdom that heredity and combined training had made available to her. The trainers, specialized soldiers whom Colonel Smith had personally selected for their observational skills and their almost limitless patience, observed every movement of the pigeon with the eyes of scientists, studied her behavior with almost obsessive precision, methodically adjusted her diet based on what they observed in her flight tests. They noticed how her speed varied according to her body weight, how her endurance improved with age, how her instincts refined and perfected with each successive training. A few months after beginning this intensive regime, Liberty could easily fly distances of 20, 30, even 40 kilometers and return to the dovecote with apparent ease, without showing visible signs of extreme exhaustion. Her endurance was extraordinary, completely unusual, comparable only to that of the best European pigeons that the American Army had previously imported at considerable costs in gold and diplomatic negotiations. The European military personnel who had accompanied these special shipments of trained birds had observed Liberty in informal competitions and reluctantly admitted that the American pigeon competed with their most select specimens. But what made Liberty special was something that could not easily be trained through repetition or behavioral conditioning. Her self-preservation instinct seemed voluntarily subordinated to a greater purpose that went completely beyond simple homecoming. It was as if she understood, in a way that scientists could never adequately explain, that her life had a meaning that extended beyond her own individual survival. Colonel Smith frequently expressed it: "This pigeon has the heart of a patriot. She is ready to die for America." By May 1915, when World War I had entered its most critical and bloodily violent phases that made the previous battles seem like mere minor skirmishes in comparison, Liberty was unanimously considered one of the best, if not the best carrier pigeon of the entire American Army. She was capable of flying considerable distances that reached even 100 kilometers from one extreme to the other, and always returning home with stunning consistency that seemed to defy the statistical laws of probability, regardless of the adversities of the path, regardless of whether it was raining torrentially, whether it was so windy that it nearly tore her from the sky, regardless of whether the night was so closed and dark that she could barely see her own wings. Colonel Smith regarded her as his most precious jewel, more valuable than any sophisticated weaponry or essential military supplies. He had literally spent hours, perhaps hundreds of hours accumulated over months, talking to her, transmitting to her in some intangible and impossible to quantify way the patriotic spirit that deeply possessed his heart as a professional soldier. The men under his command observed these interactions with a mixture of incomprehension and reverent respect, confusedly understanding that their colonel saw in this small pigeon something they themselves could barely glimpse. The storm approaches. Bellowwood 1918. The military situation in France was becoming increasingly complex and potentially explosive as the spring of 1918 approached its point of maximum tension. General John J. Pershing, undisputed leader of American forces in the region and one of the most brilliant military strategists that World War I would produce, faced German troops under General Erich Ludendorff in a series of decisive battles that would irreversibly determine the future of the entire American nation and potentially the direction that the war would take during the coming decades. The German forces were practically invincible in their fortified positions. Their famous defensive lines would have shattered any poorly prepared conventional army. Their soldiers displayed maneuverability that seemed almost magical in its effectiveness. But John J. Pershing was a cunning and reflective military man, a brilliant strategist who deeply understood that modern war could no longer be won only with fire, courage, and silent audacity. He understood that modern war required impeccable military coordination, constant and reliable communication between geographically separated positions, precise and updated intelligence on enemy movements in real time. He knew that carrier pigeons, although they were simple and primitive creatures, would be absolutely crucial in the decisive confrontations ahead that approached like an inevitable storm. That victory could very well depend on the speed with which critical information was transmitted from one side to the other of the theatrical operational area. Tensions rose daily in the military camps as intelligence from both sides reported troop movements, force concentrations, and offensive preparations. American spies operating within German lines transmitted alarming reports of reinforcements arriving from the north, of the fighting morale of German forces that remained surprisingly high despite their recent setbacks. Generals gathered in field tents and improvised barracks, drew lines on worn and faded maps, debated strategies until the early morning hours under the light of candles that flickered with each nocturnal breeze. General Pershing in particular seemed under enormous tension. His closest collaborators noticed how he barely slept, how his appetite decreased, how his eyes developed deep worry lines that seemed to dig deeper with each day without decisive confrontation. The Battle of Bellowwood was shaping up as a definitive confrontation, probably the most decisive of the entire World War I up to that moment, an encounter that would be remembered by generations of Americans. Military strategists knew deep in their souls, even without being able to fully express it in words, that communication would be absolutely crucial to coordinate the movements of the various brigades scattered across impassable, hostile, and practically unpredictable territory. Telephone lines would be vulnerable, easily cut by enemy saboteurs. Mounted messengers would be obvious targets for enemy snipers. The only truly reliable option would be carrier pigeons. Those small creatures that could fly over battle lines, that no one would think to shoot because they appeared too insignificant to be valuable targets. Liberty was selected along with other pigeons of lesser quality to be part of a messaging system that would function during the most intense fighting, during critical moments when the survival of thousands of men would depend absolutely on a message arriving on time, on the right information reaching the hands of the right commander at the right time. Her proven ability to fly long distances with mathematical precision made her an invaluable asset, almost incalculable in strictly military terms, more valuable than any general with decades of experience. Colonel Smith personally supervised the final and methodical preparations for what, although he did not consciously know, it would be Liberty's last mission. He obsessively checked over and over again that the Pigeon was in perfect physical condition, examined every feather to ensure it had no damage, that her plumage was flawless and gleaming like silver under sunlight, that her weight was optimal for the distances she was expected to fly, that her sensory orientation after all the accumulated training was impeccable, that she was psychologically prepared for any emergency that might occur during the chaotic battle. He spent long solitary nights in the dovecote, holding Liberty in his soldier hands hardened by sun and gunpowder, speaking to her in whispers inaudible to others about the fate of the nation, about the importance of her mission in an almost religious way, as if the Pigeon could understand in some supernatural way the absolute historical weight of what was ahead. None of them, neither the colonel nor his closest men, could even remotely imagine the extraordinary, deeply heroic and almost biblically significant sacrifice that this small creature, this winged being of barely 500 grams of living weight, was about to make for her homeland, for the patriotic ideals they all pursued with a devotion that bordered on religious fanaticism. The Hell Battle and the Last Mission. The dawn of June 6, 1918, turned blood red over the fields around Belleau Wood, a locality that would become synonymous with one of the most decisive battles of World War I. The sky filled with grayish smoke as night slowly gave way to daylight. American forces, trusting in their considerable numerical superiority and the legendary reputation of their elite artillery that had defeated entire armies, attacked German positions with all the fury of a patriotic storm that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of hell itself. The deafening sound of artillery, the sustained shots of machine guns that thundered incessantly in a symphony of death, and the tearing screams of thousands of soldiers in mortal combat created a hell of fire, blood, and smoke that seemed taken from the most terrible descriptions of Dante's hell, the medieval hell of the Italian poet, which differed little from the real horror that unfolded on the fields of France. General Pershing had prepared his offensive with almost surgical military precision that demonstrated years of experience and strategic reflection. He installed deep trenches methodically dug into the black and fertile earth of Belleau Wood, depths that offered his soldiers adequate protection. He spread twisted barbed wire that gleamed under the morning sun like steel tentacles and created an obstacle that would make advancement slow and bloody. He established crossfire positions that created fields of death where enemy rifle fire would be devastating, where every German soldier who dared try to cross the open spaces would be exposed simultaneously to fire from multiple angles. The battle quickly transformed into one of the bloodiest confrontations of the entire World War I, with estimated losses of thousands of men on both sides. Figures that historians still passionately debate today based on dusty and yellowed archival documents, testimonies from old men who participated in those days of incomparable horror, records from improvised military hospitals that could barely register the number of wounded. The green fields of France, which for centuries had seen wheat and barley grow, progressively turned red with each hour that passed, with each new American offensive that spectacularly and painfully failed against well-positioned German defenses. Corpses piled up in ever higher heaps of torn flesh and shredded, blood-soaked uniforms, while field flies had already begun their macabre work since morning, their millionth buzzing adding to the chaos of battle. The smell of burned gunpowder, spilled blood, death and despair spread like a visible curse over the entire surrounding territory, penetrating the lungs of every man and constantly reminding him of the reality of his situation. The dust stirred up by horse hooves and troop movements mixed with gunpowder smoke into a yellowish fog that reduced visibility and intensified the chaos of battle. It was at this critical moment of the battle, when communication between separated positions was abruptly interrupted because German saboteurs had so effectively cut the telephone lines connecting the various American military units, that Colonel James Smith received urgent orders from his direct superior, General John J. Pershing personally, who communicated through a mounted messenger who risked his life crossing enemy fire. He was to immediately send an encrypted critical message through Liberty, the best carrier pigeon of the entire American Army, a mission that could be suicidal in its danger but absolutely necessary for the survival of his men and potentially for the global outcome of the battle. The content of the message was extraordinarily sensitive and potentially explosive for military operations. It contained detailed information about a flanking encirclement movement that General Pershing was secretly preparing. Information that had been brilliantly intercepted by American scouts who prowled enemy territory. Surrounded by constant danger, Colonel Smith received this mission like a sacred investiture. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the cylinder that would contain the message, although his face remained unshakable, trained by years of military service to maintain composure even in the face of extreme adversities. He went to the dovecote where Liberty rested on her perch, a wooden structure that the colonel had built months earlier with his own hands. The Pigeon recognized him immediately, her dark eyes shining with what seemed to be special recognition of what was about to happen. "Liberty," whispered the colonel, bringing his face close to that of the Pigeon, "the moment has come. America needs you. Our men need you. Fly as you have never flown before. Fly as if you had the speed of the wind itself in your wings." Methodically, with the precision of a surgeon, the colonel prepared the small metal cylinder that would be attached with utmost care to one of Liberty's thin legs, inserting into its interior the message in complex alphanumeric code that could only be deciphered by Colonel William Brown, an experienced commander who served as chief of the receiving station strategically positioned in Reims, 80 kilometers away. The specific message that Liberty was to carry contained tactically strategic information of vital importance, the exact position of German reserves being moved for an encirclement attack, the estimated arrival time of these reinforcements, and Pershing's recommendations for a coordinated counteroffensive that would turn the German movement into a deadly trap. The information had been obtained through a network of informants operating within enemy lines, brave men who risked their lives daily. Colonel Brown urgently needed this information to adequately prepare the defense of Reims, to position his troops in positions that would allow devastating enfilade fire when the Germans tried to execute their encirclement maneuver. The success or failure of the entire battle could depend on whether Liberty managed to complete this flight. The soldiers surrounding Colonel Smith observed with a deep mixture of reverent respect and ancient fear as he prepared Liberty for her potentially deadly mission. Some of them lightly touched the gray feathers of the bird with a kind of almost religious reverence, as if touching a supernatural being that would come to their divine aid. As if their fingers could transmit some of their own strength to the small creature. The colonel spoke softly to the Pigeon, using calming and comforting words despite the apocalyptic chaos unfolding barely 100 meters away, where men were dying in ever greater numbers, where the earth was turning that dark red that could never be cleansed. The eyes of Liberty reflected a primitive but undeniably genuine intelligence, as if the bird understood in some way beyond the limits of her own animal understanding but instinctively knew the weight of her immediate responsibility, as if she could feel in her bones the importance of what she was about to do, how her actions would influence the fate of thousands of people. With chest pounding from anticipatory adrenaline and eyes shining with determination that seemed forged in the furnaces of the revolution itself, in the battle fire that consumed everything it touched, Liberty was released from the American position in the middle of the afternoon, when the American sun shone with merciless intensity over the battlefield. Her gray wings, every feather methodically cleaned and prepared during her rigorous previous training, spread against the increasingly darkening sky due to the grayish gunpowder smoke that rose in dense columns from 1,000 different points of the chaotic battlefield. The Pigeon began ascending to the heights with strong and sure movements, gaining altitude with each beat of her wings and quickly leaving behind the hellish chaos of the ground battle, where the screams of dying men mixed discordantly with the constant and incessant thunder of artillery that echoed like the pulse of hell itself. During the first 10 kilometers of her epic flight that was about to become legendary, everything seemed relatively well for Liberty, who flew at her normal cruising speed of about 50 kilometers per hour, a speed she had perfected through thousands of accumulated training hours. The Pigeon flew at a considerable and safe altitude, well above the direct firing lines of infantry rifles that speckled the territory, intelligently using the warm air currents that helped her maintain her speed and aerodynamic efficiency. It seemed the mission would be successful, that the small messenger would reach her destination without major mishaps or unexpected surprises, that the message would arrive in time for the defensive trap to be properly prepared that would radically change the course of battle. The horizon stretched before her, promising and seemingly safe. However, as the Pigeon crossed a particularly dangerous zone of intense crossfire over the open fields of Chateau Thierry, a village located between the battle lines where Americans desperately sought to hold their positions against increasingly organized German counterattacks, the unexpected and terrible happened that would change the course of events. A rifle bullet caliber 30-06, fired by a young German soldier, probably barely 19 or 20 years old, who was completely unaware of what was happening in the heights, who probably didn't even consciously realize what he had done, that he had shot at a target that would prove historically important, cleanly penetrated the bird's body with precision that seemed almost vindictive in its cruelty, almost as if fate itself was orchestrating this critical moment. The projectile, which had traveled a distance of more than 100 meters with all its kinetic energy intact, with the deadly speed that only a rifle bullet could possess, found its target in Liberty's fragile chest, as if it had a mind of its own, as if it were destined for this particular encounter. The bullet penetrated deeply into Liberty's chest, brutally tearing her delicate ribs like paper, severely damaging her blood-filled lungs, dangerously grazing her heart that pumped desperately in its desperation to continue living. The impact was so violent, so absolutely devastating in its consequences, that the Pigeon almost immediately lost complete control of flight and crashed in an uncontrollable spiral of pain and confusion that seemed to announce her immediate and inevitable end. The small body of the bird was pierced by the deadly projectile, leaving a bleeding hole at the entrance of the wound from which the very life of the creature relentlessly escaped, who had been born for this specific mission. Blood gushed from her chest, staining her gray feathers dark red and dripping to the earth so hungry for patriotic blood. The flight of agony and superhuman determination. Although practically instantly mortally wounded, with a wound that under any normal circumstances would have meant death within minutes, Liberty managed to stabilize her flight through an act of pure spiritual will that completely defied any rational or scientific understanding. Her destroyed chest moved with extreme difficulty. Each breath was absolute agony that sent indescribable and unimaginable waves of pain through her small body. Pain so intense that her nerves screamed silently, in a scream that only she could hear in the depths of her being. Blood dripped persistently from her destroyed chest, leaving a faint red trail in the air that only an extremely attentive observer would have noticed among the visible chaos and absolute confusion of the battle that continued roaring behind her like an angry beast. The damaged lungs worked with pure animal desperation to supply oxygen to a body that stubbornly refused to die, to a patriotic spirit that completely refused to abandon her sacred transmission mission. The Pigeon knew instinctively, in that primitive way that animals know the deep truths of the universe, that something terrible and absolutely irreversible had happened, that her fragile body was slowly being consumed from within by a mortal wound that could never heal or recover. But her mind, deeply imbued with months of intense training under Colonel Smith's guidance, permeated with patriotic energy that seemed to flow literally through her tiny veins like pure electricity, concentrated only on one thing that dominated every fiber of her winged existence: reaching her destination, delivering the cryptographic message, fulfilling the sacred duty that had been assigned to her. The Pigeon knew in a way that scientists could never satisfactorily explain that her death would not be in vain if she could complete her mission. The first 20 kilometers after the mortal shot were the most agonizing, the most terrible of Liberty's entire existence, a calvary of suffering that seemed to extend over an eternity. She had to fight not only against the unbearable physical pain that coursed through every part of her being, but also against her own primitive survival instincts that desperately screamed at her to go down, to find shelter in some branch or nearby tree, to rest, even if only for a moment, to allow her destroyed body a momentary respite from its agony. Her altitude slowly but relentlessly decreased, pushed down not only by the dead weight of the catastrophic wound that pierced her from side to side, but also by the growing weakness that progressively took hold of her wings, which moved with less and less precision. She flew over the villages of Epernay and Chateau Thierry, localities that had seen revolutionary armies pass, where battles still crackled and roared in the distance like an angry bestiary that was never satiated with blood, where the dull echoes of war that devoured humans without discrimination could still be heard with crystalline clarity. Each kilometer covered cost her titanic effort that seemed impossible without immediately collapsing. Each movement of her wings was a silent but firm protest from a body that was slowly bleeding out, drop by drop, in the free air of French plains that seemed to extend infinitely. At 40 kilometers into her epic and heartbreaking crossing, when a complete hour of flight had already passed that seemed like an eternity of concentrated suffering to Liberty, the small bird began experiencing terrible symptoms of progressive hemorrhagic shock that was mercilessly advancing toward its inevitable conclusion. Her vision became increasingly blurred. The colors of the landscape below blurred into a pink fog tinted with blood and unmanageable pain. Her wings didn't respond with the surgical precision she had become accustomed to after months of intense and careful training, and the sensation of absolute cold penetrated invasively into her being despite the extraordinary and completely disproportionate physical effort she was making at that moment. She trembled uncontrollably, not only because of the acute suffering that lacerated her body, but because of the progressive deterioration of her body that was relentlessly approaching its final end. However, something deep and mysterious in her small pigeon brain continued functioning in a miraculous, almost supernatural way. The internal compass that obsessively oriented her toward her final destination, toward Reims, toward Colonel Brown, who desperately awaited her message. The dovecote in Boston was not in her mind at this critical and agonizing moment. The instinct that guided her was different, more powerful than anything she could imagine, more transcendent than simple repatriation. It was as if a force greater than herself, an almost divine force that stemmed from the accumulated suffering of thousands of patriotic soldiers, forced her to continue without pause. It was as if the death screams of the men dying in Belleau Wood had permanently impregnated her being with an almost sacred responsibility that went far beyond the simple individual survival of the small bird. The final kilometers, the miracle of will. The wounded pigeon slowly adjusted her route with the precision of an experienced pilot, now flying considerably lower to better use the warm air currents emanating from the earth warmed by the American sun and to minimize the extreme respiratory effort that was literally destroying her damaged lungs. She passed over the colonial estates of France with their traditional architectural structures, over green wheat fields where frightened farmers desperately sought shelter hiding under wood piles, where entire families hid in deep ditches to avoid becoming additional victims of the uncontrolled patriotic violence that seemed to consume everything in its path. Her chest continued bleeding without mercy, bleeding that seemed to have no end, that responded to nothing acceptance of immediately impending death, but Liberty's heartbeat remained firm and constant. Nourished by a determination that completely defied all known biological logic, all medical understanding of what was possible. Her heart beat like a primitive war drum, pumping increasingly scarce blood through veins that weakened momentarily and transformed into weaker conductors of life itself. Another 40 kilometers and she would finally be in the zone of military positions at Reims, where waiting for her message was absolutely desperate, where generals constantly looked to the sky with eyes that alternated between hope and despair. Enemy generals secretly prepared for devastating offensives based on intelligence that could be intercepted and used to their deadly disadvantage. Colonel William Brown needed this message with almost psychotic urgency to coordinate the defense of his position, to know whether his troops had minutes or days to prepare. The American nation fundamentally needed this message to save itself from total chaos that threatened to consume it. And Liberty, despite the unspeakable suffering that lacerated her body like millions of invisible knives, knew it with absolute certainty that transcended normal understanding of the animal world. As the agonizing Pigeon approached the final 30 kilometers of her epic and heartbreaking flight, flying through the golden twilight landscape that transformed reality into fire tones, her body was in a state of deterioration that seemed biologically impossible to continue living and remain in active flight. The wound in her chest had become exponentially deeper and more destructive, not through the action of an additional projectile, but because her own internal bleeding continued its destructive work without mercy, slowly eating the vital tissues from within and consuming organ by organ. Coagulated blood had progressively accumulated in the Pigeon's air sacs, dramatically impairing her breathing capacity in a way that became increasingly visible in her struggle to breathe. Each breath became an epic battle against impending suffocation. Each heartbeat was an act of pure rebellion against death that lurked silently from all possible angles. The small bird flew through pure and absolute suffering, transforming each drop of spilled blood into additional kilometers covered for the salvation of thousands of human lives that depended on the message she carried on her trembling leg. The mountains of France rose before her like gray and majestic monuments on the horizon that became increasingly near and tangible. Liberty recognized these unmistakable geological formations from her previous training under Colonel Smith's knowledgeable and loving guidance. She knew with absolute certainty that she was close, immediately at her final destination that represented both her death and her symbolic salvation. Her flight, though irregular and difficult to maintain in a straight line, followed a determined and precise trajectory that led her directly to the hills where American forces were entrenched and awaiting her message. She flew so low that she almost touched the bushes of the French wasteland that stuck out like dry earth fingers. Her wings occasionally brushed the tips of wild thistles growing in the arid territory, plants that had been witnesses to countless patriotic tragedies during months of combat. The message she carried, that tiny metal cylinder attached to her left leg that contained information that could change the fate of thousands of lives, weighed like a mountain in her patriotic consciousness. She could barely feel the leg anymore. Numbness and anesthesia took hold of her as blood loss continued its silent and methodical work, slowly draining the vitality from her peripheral limbs. Her brain began experiencing the first symptoms of insufficient oxygen, gray cells dying from lack of adequate circulation. At 25 kilometers from the final destination, Liberty began perceiving a fundamental change in her surrounding environment. German trenches began appearing among the folds of mountainous terrain, small fortresses built with sandbags filled with earth, strategically reinforced with tree trunks that had been felled during defensive preparations. The soldiers guarding these defensive positions, tired and hardened men who had seen too much death during the last months of constant combat, occasionally raised their sleepy heads to the gray storm sky searching for signs of unexpected enemy approach. None of them expected to see a carrier pigeon at this critical moment, much less one that was visibly bleeding and dropping a trail of red droplets on the dry stones of the ground and the parched and compacted earth of the battlefield. A young soldier, barely a boy of 16 who had been recruited just 3 months earlier because practically all available adult men were already in military service, saw the characteristic silhouette of Liberty approaching from the west like a flying shadow. The boy shouted at the top of his lungs to alert his comrades with obvious urgency, pointing to the sky with both hands with the urgency of one who had just sighted a sign of vital absolute importance. Soldiers crowded near the established guard posts, their eyes scanning the darkening sky to locate the source of the young man's legitimate panic. Liberty appeared and disappeared among the turbulence of hot air rising from the heated earth, her irregular and unsteady flight clearly showing that something was terribly wrong, that this was not a pigeon under normal operating conditions. Her blood-red chest gleamed against the sky whenever clouds separated enough to let direct sunrays through. Experienced soldiers immediately recognized what they were seeing. A carrier pigeon in critical condition, practically dying, but still flying with determination that seemed to defy the laws of biological nature itself. At 20 kilometers from the final destination, Liberty experienced a moment of extraordinary clarity that seemed to be from another world, as if her entire life as a carrier pigeon passed before her eyes in a fleeting moment of total vision. She remembered with crystalline precision the warm and gentle hand of Colonel Smith stroking her feathers on the morning of her release for this mission. She remembered the unmistakable sound of battle that echoed in her ears as she took off from the initial position in Belleau Wood. She remembered the exact sensation, moment by moment, of the bullet impact that pierced her body like an act of cosmic violence. In that moment of deep clarity, she knew with undeniable certainty that she would not live to see the completion of her journey, knew that her wounded body would not resist beyond a few additional minutes of flight. However, this absolute knowledge did not frighten or stop her in her purpose. On the contrary, what she felt was a strange and comforting peace, a deep acceptance of her inescapable destiny, as if her small life had a purpose that went completely beyond temporal physical existence. That purpose was to reach Reims, deliver the cryptographic message, and allow thousands of men to live because she had chosen to voluntarily die. The flight became increasingly laborious as she approached 15 kilometers from the destination that gleamed on the horizon. Liberty's internal organs began failing one by one, not in a sudden catastrophic collapse, but in slow and agonizing degradation that seemed to extend over an entire eternity. Her heart, which minutes before had beaten with titanic force, now struggled visibly to maintain the constant rhythm that her chest muscles needed to maintain active flight. Blood pressure plummeted dangerously, causing dizziness that made her vision spin in uncontrollable spirals that momentarily disoriented her. Her wings, which once moved with the precision of a machine perfected through months of training, now moved irregularly and unsteadily, as if they didn't completely obey the commands her increasingly weakening brain sent them. It was an almost divine miracle that she was still in the air. A miracle that scientists and doctors could probably never satisfactorily explain. A miracle that existed only in the heart of a small patriotic pigeon who stubbornly refused to accept final defeat. The final arrival and the message that changed everything. At 10 kilometers from the glorious and final destination, Liberty saw the peak of Reims Hill rising before her like the most important, most significant goal of her complete existence. The American fortifications became increasingly visible with each meter she advanced, and she could clearly distinguish soldiers moving among the deep trenches, some of them observing the sky and expecting exactly what was happening at this precise moment. Colonel William Brown was somewhere in that defensive position desperately awaiting a message that became more urgent with each minute that passed on the chaotic battlefield. In the Battle of Belleau Wood, time had become a currency more valuable than gold, more valuable than any earthly treasure. Each minute could mean the difference between complete victory and catastrophic defeat, between life and death of thousands of men under his command. Liberty understood this instinctively, with an understanding that went beyond simple animal biology that would define her small avian brain, as if the desperation of soldiers had impregnated her cells and given her the supernatural strength she needed. At 5 kilometers away, when the small bird whose agony was almost visible from the ground had only minutes left to live, something extraordinary happened in the trenches of Reims that would change the interpretation of this event for history. An experienced guard, a soldier named Thomas Williams who had served under General Pershing's orders since the violent beginning of the war years earlier, recognized the specific characteristics of Liberty's distinctive flight. He had seen this pigeon in previous training at nearby positions, knew her particular way of moving through the air, the characteristic way she tilted her wings to maintain balance, the sound characteristics of her flight. He shouted at the top of his lungs, alerting everyone present in the defensive position, urgently communicating that a carrier pigeon was approaching from the west. His shout was a combination of pure urgency and reverent respect, as if he already knew in some mysterious and almost prophetic way that what he was witnessing was something historical, something transcendental, something that historians would one day study with admiring fascination. Colonel Brown was immediately alerted about the approach of the winged messenger. He left his strategic maps carefully arranged on the improvised command table in the underground main trench and emerged to the elevated guard positions, his eyes anxiously searching the sky clouded with thick battle smoke occurring several kilometers away. He saw the small black figure slowly approaching, very slowly, too slowly to be normal. He immediately knew with the intuition that only experienced military personnel possess that something was wrong, that this pigeon was not flying with the normal movement and speed pattern. His unique military experience allowed him to understand that Liberty had been hit by enemy fire, that she had reached the absolute limit of her last forces, that he was probably witnessing one of those stories of animal heroism that people murmured around patriotic campfires on nights of contemplation. With a voice that rang clear and strong over the relative chaos of the military position, Brown ordered his men to prepare to receive the messenger with all the honors she deserved, to secure the message at any cost, to have medical supplies ready in case it might be possible to save the brave bird that was approaching. The sky over the hills of Reims had taken on that characteristic grayish color of American twilight, when sunlight begins dramatically disappearing among the mountains and shadows lengthen like ghostly fingers over rocky terrain. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening of June 6, 1918, and Colonel William Brown's position was at absolute maximum alert. The men under his command, about 250 American soldiers hardened through intense months of merciless combat, attentively monitored the approaches to the defensive hill, constantly expecting any German movement that would announce an imminent attack. Tension in the air was palpable, almost material in its materiality, as if the atmosphere itself were compressed under the suffocating weight of strategic uncertainty that afflicted the entire unit. Persistent rumors about German reinforcements from the north ran from trench to trench like uncontrollable fire, and no one knew whether they had minutes, hours, or just seconds before a human wave of enemies arrived ready to massacre anyone who stood in the way of their path. It was then that one of the vigilant guards, a young soldier of barely 19 named Michael Johnson, who belonged specifically to the company of scouts specialized in aerial surveillance, screamed with all his might a message that made all the men in the position instinctively raise their weapons and look to the sky. "Pigeon, Colonel." A pigeon coming from the west. His young and excited voice echoed over the entire hill like a bronze bell, penetrating all barriers of ambient noise, and immediately, Colonel Brown, who at that moment was in his field tent woven with canvas methodically reviewing maps of the region with his executive general staff, emerged as if propelled by an invisible spring. His khaki uniform was stained with fine dust from the trenches, his boots were worn from weeks of constant marching on rocky terrain, but his eyes burned with the intensity of a man who knew that history was being written at that precise moment. The colonel rushed to the highest observation point, a position constructed with sandbags and wooden logs that offered panoramic view of the surrounding valley. From there, with his field binoculars, he could clearly see the small figure of Liberty approaching with evident difficulty, her flight irregular and labored, visibly different from the strong and sure flight he had observed in previous training exercises. The pigeon seemed to struggle against invisible forces, her wings moved with less coordination than usual, and even at that distance, the colonel could perceive that something was terribly wrong. His trained military eye immediately detected the irregularity in the flight pattern, the way the bird seemed to lose altitude intermittently, the manner in which her movements suggested exhaustion or injury. "That pigeon has been hit," he murmured to his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Sarah Williams, a young officer who had distinguished herself in communications and had particular experience with carrier pigeons. "She's wounded, but she's still flying. By God, she's still flying." The men around him observed in absolute silence as the small gray figure continued approaching, each wing beat seeming to cost enormous effort. Someone whispered a prayer, another crossed himself. The veterans among them, those who had seen enough war to understand the significance of what they were witnessing, felt a knot form in their throats. They were seeing something extraordinary, something that would be talked about around campfires for years to come. Something that embodied the very spirit that had brought them to fight in foreign lands for the ideals they held dear. Liberty was no longer just a pigeon carrying a message. She had become a symbol of determination, of sacrifice, of the refusal to surrender that defined the American character in its finest hour. At 3 kilometers from the position, the observers could see more clearly the tragic state of the brave messenger. Her chest feathers were stained dark with blood that continued dripping, creating a barely visible red trail against the gray evening sky. Her flight altitude varied constantly, sometimes rising as if making a superhuman effort to gain height, sometimes descending as if her strength was finally abandoning her. But what was most impressive, what moved even the most hardened soldiers, was the unwavering direction of her flight. Despite her evident agony, despite the pain that must have been coursing through her small body, Liberty maintained her course toward the position with mathematical precision, as if an invisible force guided her beyond her own physical limitations. Colonel Brown prepared his men for what was coming. "When that pigeon arrives," he said in a voice firm enough to be heard by all nearby soldiers, "I want complete silence. I want the medic ready with bandages and any supplies that might help a wounded bird. I want the message extracted carefully, and I want it decoded immediately. That bird is dying to bring us information that could save hundreds of our comrades. We owe her the respect and efficiency her sacrifice deserves." His words spread quickly through the position, and an atmosphere of reverent expectation settled over the trenches. Men who had laughed at death, who had charged through machine gun fire without flinching, found themselves moved by the approaching sacrifice of a small gray pigeon who had chosen duty over survival. At 1 kilometer from the position, Liberty began her final descent, not by choice but because her body could no longer maintain altitude. Her wings, which had carried her 80 kilometers through enemy territory and mortal danger, trembled with exhaustion and pain. Blood loss had reached critical levels. Her vision blurred intermittently, and her sense of balance was severely compromised. But somehow, through what could only be described as pure willpower made manifest in biological form, she continued flying toward the position where American soldiers waited in silent anticipation. The descent became more pronounced as she approached the first defensive lines. At 500 meters, soldiers could clearly see the extent of her injuries. The bullet wound in her chest was visible even from that distance, a dark stain that contrasted sharply with her gray plumage. Her breathing was labored, visible in the irregular rhythm of her wing beats. Some soldiers later said they could hear a faint whistle with each breath, the sound of air passing through damaged lung tissue. Others swore they could see her legs trembling from the effort of carrying the precious message cylinder that represented her entire reason for being at that moment. At 200 meters, Liberty began what would be her final approach to the landing area. Colonel Brown had designated a specific section of the main trench, cleared of equipment and covered with clean cloth, as the reception point. The regimental medic, Sergeant Robert Smith, knelt beside the designated area with medical supplies adapted for treating a small bird, clean bandages, antiseptic solution, and a small box lined with soft fabric that could serve as a recovery nest if the Pigeon survived her injuries. At 100 meters, everyone in the position could see that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Liberty's flight had become erratic, but her determination remained absolute. She flew in a slightly zigzag pattern, occasionally losing altitude suddenly before recovering with what seemed like superhuman effort. Her small body, no larger than a man's fist, carried not only the physical weight of the message cylinder but the spiritual weight of thousands of lives that hung in the balance. The cylinder, barely visible attached to her left leg, caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the battlefield smoke, gleaming like a tiny beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. At 50 meters, Colonel Brown could see Liberty's eyes, small black points that seemed to burn with an inner fire that transcended mere animal instinct. Those eyes held something that veterans recognized but could rarely articulate: the look of someone who has accepted death in service of something greater than themselves. It was the same look they had seen in the eyes of comrades who had thrown themselves on grenades to save their units, who had charged machine gun nests knowing they would not return, who had chosen sacrifice over survival when the moment of truth arrived. At 20 meters, the Pigeon's flight became critically unstable. She tilted to one side, nearly crashing into the side of the trench before recovering with a desperate effort that visibly cost her greatly. Blood droplets fell more frequently now, creating tiny dark spots on the wooden duckboards that lined the bottom of the trench. Her breathing was increasingly labored, each wing beat a visible struggle against the inevitable. But still, she flew toward the designated landing area with the accuracy of a guided missile, as if some internal compass continued functioning even as her body prepared to shut down permanently. At 10 meters, Liberty attempted her final approach to the landing area. Her wings, which had carried her farther and longer than any pigeon had a right to fly with such severe injuries, finally began to fail her. She managed one last burst of coordinated flight, a final display of the skill and determination that had made her the finest messenger pigeon in the American Army. Then, as if every reserve of strength had been exhausted simultaneously, she began to fall. But even in falling, Liberty demonstrated the extraordinary intelligence and dedication that had defined her service. Instead of crashing helplessly, she managed a controlled descent, using her remaining strength to guide herself toward the soft cloth that Colonel Brown had prepared. Her landing was hard but not catastrophic, her small body hitting the fabric with enough force to bounce once before settling into stillness. The sound of her impact seemed unnaturally loud in the absolute silence that had fallen over the position, a silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the faint, labored breathing of a dying pigeon who had just completed the most important mission of her life. The moment Liberty landed, Sergeant Smith moved with professional efficiency to assess her condition while Colonel Brown worked to carefully remove the message cylinder from her leg. The pigeon's eyes were still open, still aware, but her breathing was shallow and irregular. Blood continued to seep from the bullet wound in her chest, staining the white cloth beneath her. Her wings were spread at awkward angles, no longer capable of the coordinated movement that had brought her through 80 kilometers of enemy territory and personal agony. As Colonel Brown carefully extracted the message cylinder, his hands shaking slightly from the emotional weight of the moment, Liberty turned her small head slightly to watch him work. In those black eyes, the colonel later swore he saw not pain or fear, but something approaching satisfaction. As if the pigeon understood that her mission was finally complete. The message cylinder came free easily, its weight so small that it seemed impossible something so light could carry information vital to the survival of thousands of men. Colonel Brown immediately opened the cylinder and extracted the coded message, his experienced eyes quickly scanning the alphanumeric sequences that would need to be decoded. Even without full decryption, he could see that this was high-priority intelligence, the kind of information that could indeed change the course of battle. He handed the message to his communications officer for immediate decoding while turning his attention back to the small hero who had delivered it. Liberty lay still on the white cloth, her chest rising and falling with increasingly weak breaths. Sergeant Smith had applied what medical aid he could, cleaning the wound and applying pressure to stop the bleeding, but they all understood that the injuries were beyond treatment with field medical supplies designed for humans, not small birds. The bullet had done too much internal damage, had destroyed too many vital organs for recovery to be possible. Colonel Brown knelt beside the dying Pigeon, his battle-hardened exterior cracking slightly as he witnessed the final moments of such extraordinary courage. "You did it, girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible to the soldiers who had gathered in a respectful circle around the landing area. "You brought us the message. You saved lives today. You saved American lives." Whether Liberty could understand his words or merely responded to the gentle tone of his voice, her eyes seemed to focus on his face with what could only be described as recognition and, perhaps, gratitude. The decoded message confirmed the intelligence's critical importance. German forces were indeed preparing a massive flanking maneuver, exactly as General Pershing had suspected. The information Liberty had carried provided precise timing, troop numbers, and approach routes that would allow American forces to prepare a devastating counterattack. The trap could be set, the ambush prepared, and what might have been a catastrophic defeat could be transformed into a decisive victory. Hundreds, possibly thousands of American lives would be saved because of the information carried by a small gray pigeon who had refused to let death stop her from completing her duty. As the sun set completely behind the hills of France, casting the battlefield into the deep shadows of night, Liberty drew her final breath. Her small chest rose once more, held for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, then settled into the absolute stillness that marks the boundary between life and death. The soldiers around her removed their helmets, some bowing their heads in a moment of silent respect for the small creature who had demonstrated such extraordinary valor. In the distance, artillery continued to thunder, men continued to fight and die, and the great wheel of war continued its relentless turning. But in that small circle of cloth in an American trench in France, something transcendent had occurred. A pigeon named Liberty, born in the outskirts of Boston and trained by a colonel who had lost too many friends to poor communication, had written her name in the annals of heroism. She had proven that courage knows no boundaries of size or species, that dedication to duty can overcome even the certainty of death, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies but by individuals who refuse to surrender when surrender would be easier than continuing. Colonel Brown carefully wrapped Liberty's small body in clean cloth, treating her with the same respect he would show a fallen soldier. He made arrangements for her to be buried with military honors behind the position, in a small grave marked with a wooden cross bearing her name and the date of her final mission. The message she had carried was transmitted immediately to higher command, and within hours the defensive preparations were in place that would indeed turn the German flanking maneuver into a costly failure. Years later, when the war had ended and survivors told their stories around peaceful fireplaces, the tale of Liberty would be repeated countless times. She would become a symbol not just of animal intelligence or training, but of the American spirit that refuses to yield when duty calls. Children would hear her story and understand something fundamental about what it means to serve something greater than oneself. Veterans would tell the tale with voices that cracked with emotion, remembering the small gray pigeon who had taught them that heroism comes in all forms and that the measure of courage is not in size or strength but in the willingness to continue when continuing seems impossible. In that moment, as Liberty drew her last breath surrounded by soldiers who had been moved to tears by her sacrifice, she had become more than a carrier pigeon. She had become a legend, a symbol, a reminder that in the darkest hours of human conflict, examples of courage and dedication can emerge from the most unexpected sources. Her story would outlive the war, outlive the men who witnessed her final flight, and outlive even the memory of the specific battle she had helped win. Because Liberty had proven something that transcends military strategy or tactical advantage, that the spirit of service, the willingness to sacrifice for others, and the refusal to abandon duty even in the face of certain death represent the highest ideals of both human and animal nature. Her small body lay still on the white cloth as darkness fell over the battlefield, but her legacy had already taken flight, carried not on wings of flesh and feather but on the memories and hearts of those who had witnessed true heroism in its purest form. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage and sacrifice throughout history. Share this story with others who appreciate the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals in times of war. The Battle of Belleau Wood was indeed transformed by the intelligence Liberty had delivered. American forces, forewarned of the German flanking maneuver, prepared a devastating ambush that caught the enemy completely off guard. What had been planned as a surprise attack became a trap that cost the German forces hundreds of casualties and forced them to retreat from positions they had held for weeks. The tactical advantage gained from Liberty's message contributed directly to the broader American success in the battle and helped establish the reputation of American forces as formidable fighters capable of sophisticated military operations. In the months that followed, other carrier pigeons would serve with distinction, but none would equal the legend of Liberty in her final flight. Her story spread through the American expeditionary forces, told and retold until it became part of the oral tradition of the war. Soldiers facing their own moments of crisis would remember the small gray pigeon who had refused to quit, and many later credited her example with giving them the strength to continue when their own situations seemed hopeless. Colonel James Smith, upon learning of Liberty's fate, wept openly for the first time since the war began. He had trained many pigeons, had seen many serve with distinction, but Liberty had been special from the beginning. He wrote a letter to his wife describing the pigeon's final mission. A letter that would be preserved in family archives and eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution as part of their collection of wartime correspondence. In that letter, he wrote, "She was more than just a bird. She was a soldier, a hero, and a reminder of what we're fighting for. If a small pigeon can show such courage and dedication, how can we as men do any less?" The wooden cross that marked Liberty's grave behind the American position at Reims was eventually replaced by a small stone marker funded by contributions from soldiers who had served in the battle. The inscription, carved by a soldier who had been a stonecutter in civilian life, read simply, "Liberty, carrier pigeon, hero, she delivered when it mattered most." After the war, the marker was moved to Arlington National Cemetery, where it stands today in a small section dedicated to the animal heroes of America's wars. General John J. Pershing himself, upon reading the report of Liberty's final mission, issued a commendation that was unprecedented in its recognition of an animal's service. The commendation praised not only the pigeon's successful completion of her mission under extreme duress but also the example she had set for human soldiers. Pershing wrote, "In the annals of this war, we will remember the great battles, the strategic victories, and the sacrifices of brave men. We should also remember Liberty, a pigeon who demonstrated that heroism knows no boundaries and that duty, once accepted, must be fulfilled regardless of the cost." The story of Liberty became part of the curriculum at military academies, taught not just as an example of effective communication in warfare but as a case study in determination and duty. Young officers studying military history learned about the Battle of Belleau Wood and the critical intelligence that changed its outcome, but they also learned about the small creature who had delivered that intelligence at the ultimate cost. Her story became a touchstone for discussions about leadership, sacrifice, and the bonds that form between humans and animals in extreme circumstances. In Boston, where Liberty had been born and trained, a small monument was erected in the park near where Colonel Smith's dovecote had stood. The monument, funded by veterans organizations and local civic groups, featured a bronze sculpture of a pigeon in flight, wings spread wide as if caught at the moment of landing. The base of the monument bore the names of all the carrier pigeons who had served with American forces during World War I, but Liberty's name was inscribed in larger letters at the top, recognizing her unique place in the history of animal heroism. Every year on June 6, the anniversary of Liberty's final flight, veterans and their families gathered at the monument for a brief ceremony of remembrance. Children would place small American flags around the base while veterans told stories of the war and the importance of duty and sacrifice. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, a way of ensuring that the lessons of Liberty's courage would be passed to new generations who might never face such extreme circumstances but who could still learn from her example of selfless service. The training methods developed by Colonel Smith for Liberty and his other pigeons were studied and refined by military communications specialists, leading to improvements in how carrier pigeons were prepared for combat missions. Smith's detailed training logs, preserved in military archives, provided insights into pigeon psychology and capabilities that influenced military use of animals for decades. His emphasis on building emotional bonds between trainers and pigeons, his systematic approach to distance and endurance training, and his understanding of how motivation could overcome physical limitations became standard practices in military animal training programs. Years after the war, as radio communication made carrier pigeons obsolete for military purposes, the story of Liberty took on new significance. She became a symbol not just of military service but of the timeless values that make civilization possible: loyalty, courage, perseverance, and the willingness to serve others even at great personal cost. Her story was adapted into children's books, military histories, and educational films that introduced her legend to audiences who had never experienced war but who could still appreciate the universal message of her sacrifice. Modern military historians studying World War I communications have noted that Liberty's final mission represented one of the most successful intelligence deliveries of the war, with direct tactical consequences that saved hundreds of lives and influenced a major battle outcome. Her story appears in academic studies of military communication, animal psychology, and the human-animal bond in extreme situations. Researchers have used her case to better understand how animals can be motivated to perform beyond normal biological limitations when properly trained and emotionally invested in their missions. The legacy of Liberty extended beyond military circles into broader American culture, where her story became part of the national narrative about courage, determination, and service. She appeared in patriotic literature, Memorial Day speeches, and discussions about what it means to be American. Her example was cited by leaders facing difficult decisions, by ordinary citizens dealing with personal challenges, and by anyone who needed to remember that size and strength are less important than heart and determination when facing overwhelming odds. In the end, Liberty's greatest victory was not the successful delivery of a single message or the lives saved by the intelligence she carried. Her greatest victory was proving that heroism is not limited by species, size, or strength but is defined by the willingness to serve others regardless of the personal cost. She demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to continue despite fear, and that duty, once accepted, creates obligations that transcend individual survival instincts. Her small gray body now rests beneath American soil, but her spirit continues to inspire all who hear her story. She remains a reminder that in our darkest hours, when the odds seem impossible and the cost appears too high to pay, ordinary creatures can accomplish extraordinary things through the simple decision to never give up. Liberty proved that heroes come in all forms and that the measure of greatness is not in what we are but in what we choose to do when doing right means risking everything. As long as people value courage, remember, sacrifice, and honor those who serve others before themselves, the story of Liberty will continue to inspire and instruct. She was a small pigeon with a great heart, and her final flight across the battlefields of France remains one of the most powerful examples of heroism in American military history. Remember her story, share it with others, and let her example inspire you to find your own courage when life demands your best. Like this video if Liberty's story moved you, and subscribe for more incredible tales of heroism and sacrifice throughout history.